what man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it?
Turn our Bibles, we'll get going straight away. We're going to go to John chapter 5, and we're going from verses 1 to 15. And we are on this series called The One, realizing that all of us have a responsibility to reach the one that is in our lives. God hasn't trusted them to anybody else, He's trusted them to you, for you to reach them. And so we're teaching through the miracles in John. The Gospel of John has 7 miracles in them. In fact, John doesn't call them miracles, he calls them signs, because they're telling us and showing us something about Jesus and about how he relates to people and works with people and works in our lives. So we're looking through these miracles. We're on the 3rd miracle today, the healing of the man at a pool called Bethesda. So let's read it together. Chapter 5, verse 1. It says, sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there was in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. And here a great number of people, of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool. When the water is stirred, while I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured, and he picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is a Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. Just to help you with the context of what is happening here, the type of pool that Jesus did this healing, it wasn't a kind of package holiday pool or an Aberdeen Beach Leisure Centre pool. I think we've got a picture here that they're going to throw up on the screen. This is what the pool of Bethesda looked like. It was actually 2 pools. They reckon maybe one was for men and one was for women. Years before, they dammed this area. It was a low-lying valley just to the north of the temple in Jerusalem. And they dammed this area so water had gathered there. And by the time the Romans were there, they built these colonnades around these pools of water. You know, in Roman times, it was popular to gather at a pool to bathe, and it was a social affair to do this. And so many people would come to these pools, bathe in the water. It was about the size of a football pitch, about 20 foot deep, and people would come there, many people. But this particular pool was unique in that the Bible says, or there's a verse that was added perhaps later, describes how an angel would come down and stir up the water. And when the water was stirred, the first person who could get into the pool would be healed of whatever sickness they had. And so many people, it says multitudes, gathered in these colonnades, people that were sick. They would gather in these underneath these the roof there, and they would wait just in case the water would be stirred. They could go and get their healing. And so Jesus arrives here, and he looks across at these people, and he finds one man who he reaches out to, and he instantly heals him by what he said. And so this one man was transformed instantly because he encountered Jesus. So we're going to look at this man who was healed and how his life was transformed. But what I want us to understand here is there were different perspectives taking place on the same miracle. Different people saw it from a different perspective. Isn't that in life? Have you ever been in a situation where you thought one thing was happening, but actually something completely different was happening? You ever received a text and you think, why did they say it like that? And then you meet the person and realize they didn't mean that like that at all. Yeah, we sometimes misunderstand what's going on. And this is due to our perspective. It's because of our perspective. There's a great story of an Englishman who gets on a train, and he's early for his train. Maybe the train's late, but anyway, it's not going anywhere. And so he goes to the shop in the train station, and he buys a newspaper, he gets a cup of coffee, and a bag of cookies. And he takes them on the train. He has a table seat, so he sits down at his table, and he gets himself sorted. And along down the carriage comes a businessman. He's carrying a briefcase, and the businessman comes down, puts his case over the seat, and he sits down opposite this Englishman. And the Englishman thinks he looks like a safe man to be sat opposite. He's not going to do anything strange or try and talk to me or anything like that. But then what happens astounds this Englishman. The businessman reaches over, undoes the packet of cookies, and takes a cookie out of the packet and eats it. The Englishman, his mind explodes. What do you do in a situation like that? You know, us who are Brits, we are not taught in any way in our culture how to deal with an awkward situation like that. What do we do? How do we handle this? And so he does what any red-blooded, hot-headed Englishman does, and he looks out the window and completely ignores that this businessman has just taken and opened his cookies and eaten one. A few moments pass, and sure enough, the businessman reaches his fingers into the packet, takes another cookie. The man thinks, what am I going to do now? How do I broach this? I didn't correct him the first time. I can't do it the second time. And so he sat there, and the train pulls off, and he's thinking, how am I going to handle this situation? He then thinks, I know, here's the grand plan. This is what I'll do. I'll reach in, and I'll take out one of the cookies. Then he'll know that they're really my cookies, and he shouldn't be eating them. So he reaches in, but moments later, the businessman reaches his hand in, takes one of the cookies out, and they go through the whole packet of cookies, each one taking one, until the whole packet has gone. The businessman's stop arrives, his station comes, and so he gets up, and he kind of gives a look to the man, takes his briefcase, and walks off. The Englishman thinks, oh, brilliant, finally, it's all over. The tension has left the seating area. And so he sits back, and he's relaxed. He's the next station, and so his station arrives. He stands up, and he chugs down the last of his coffee. He picks up his newspaper, and underneath his newspaper, sure enough, are his own cookies. He'd been eating the businessman's cookies all along. They weren't even his cookies. And he completely misread and misunderstood the situation. And what I love about this is there's a businessman somewhere who's telling people a story about how once he was sat across this guy who just reached over and ate his cookies, and he doesn't have the punchline of actually they weren't his cookies. So it's so easy to miss the point, to misread a situation. I don't know whether you ever saw the 2008 movie Vantage Point. It was about an assassination attempt on a US president, and they played it out, and then it rewound and started again and showed you the events from a different perspective, from a different vantage point. But our vantage point is critical in the effectiveness on reaching the one. Perspective is huge in how you view the world around you. And what I want to talk about today is having a vantage point for the one. If you look up vantage point in the dictionary, you'll read something like a place that provides a good view, or a position or standpoint to view or to interpret a situation or a person. And we need to take a position, a vantage point of others, of focusing on others. You know, the drumbeat of Christian life is others, 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 others. We live for others. We live for Jesus, but we love God, and then what do we do at the same time? We love others. We love our neighbor as we love God. And so we take the vantage point of focusing on living for the one. And when I read this story, this miracle here, several times or 3 times we see how people saw or they noticed something. You see how Jesus turns up to this pool and he sees a man who's been lying there for 38 years. He's healed, and then the religious leaders notice that he's carrying his mat, and they challenge him because of what they have seen. And then later in the temple, Jesus comes to this man and he says, look at yourself, look at you now. And so we see this idea of seeing or noticing. And what it's showing us is different vantage points or different interpretations of the same miracle. And so we're going to unpack this together, and it will show us how we can have a vantage point for the one. See, after John sets the context for the story and describes the pool for us, he introduces us to this man who's been lying there and how Jesus sees him. 38 years this man has been lying on the colonnade, hoping that the pool would be stirred and that he could get in and receive his miracle. 38 years he's been here. And what fascinates me is Jesus comes, and the Bible says that there were a great number or a multitude of people in the similar situations, and yet Jesus picks out one man. He focuses on one person. And it always fascinates me, I don't know whether it does you, when you read the New Testament, particularly Acts, when the apostles are healing people, they're healing people that Jesus would have encountered, and yet Jesus didn't heal them in his earthly ministry. When you think about Acts 3, there's a man sat by Gate Beautiful who's been put there for many years begging, and Peter and James go along and they heal the man. But actually, Jesus would have walked past the same man for all the years that he would have gone into the temple, for the years that he would have been around Jerusalem, and yet he didn't heal them. And I don't have an answer for you today why Jesus didn't heal the great number there. But what we can tell and what we do know is that Jesus chose one man. See, God is about relentlessly pursuing the one. God chooses one. And, you know, I think when Jesus arrived there, he could have had a revival. Jesus could have gone along those colonnades and said, you're healed, you're healed, you're healed, and could have led a revival at that pool, and yet he chose one to move in his life. And we love to hear about revivals. And we love to hear about many people. When Peter got up and preached and 3,000 were saved that day, many added to the number. We love to hear these stories when actually I think the pattern that the New Testament gives us is one by one. Here, all of us were saved one by one, weren't we? If we were to hand around this flapping microphone, then you would all have your unique story to tell how Jesus saved your life. Yes? How you heard the gospel, and yes, the gospel, the truth of the gospel is the same for every single person, but all of us were led on a unique journey to the realization of the truth of that gospel. And we try to make God a cookie-cutter God. That God, you just save people the same over and over again, put them through the factory or the machine of salvation and they'll get saved. But God is a father, and he pursues his children and he leads them uniquely according to the unique purpose and destiny that he has for us. And here's why I think we love revivals. Here's why we love the story of many people coming to faith and a preacher showed up or a healer showed up, because it gives us an excuse not to do what is our duty. If we say, oh no, the people in my world, I just need to get them to hear the preacher. Oh, we just need more Billy Grahams and more Reinhard Bonnke's. They can do the work of getting them saved. But actually, it's each and every one of our responsibility to reach the people around us. And what is shown in these miracles and throughout the New Testament is Jesus going to one person. He's showing us a model. Find one person. Because I think sometimes we can show up at the pool of Bethesda of our lives and we see the multitude and we think it's too big. There's too much. I can't get all of these people saved. I can't share the gospel with all these people, but we can do it for one person. And I wonder who the one is that you're pursuing. You'll forgive me if you were here a couple of evenings ago when I was sharing about on this series, but David Watson is a Christian author, and he wrote a book about evangelism a few decades ago, and they ran some numbers to figure out this whole idea of reaching people. And what he said is you're an outstanding evangelist, you can share the gospel with power, people come to faith, and if you get 1,000 people saved every night, so you start preaching and you do it consecutively, every day you get 1,000 people saved, they worked out how long it would take that evangelist to reach the whole world. And when they did the numbers, it came just over 10,000 years it would take you to preach and for the whole world to receive salvation. 10,000 years. But then they figured out, what if we, just a normal, ordinary Christian, reached out to one person and they got saved in their whole life? Just one person. And if they said to that one person, all you need to do is reach out to one person and show them Jesus and lead them to the truth of salvation, and then that person led one person. You understand? Just one person, one person, one person. They worked it out. You know, it would take 32 years for us to reach every single person on the face of the planet. 32 years. If all of us just reached one person, we could see salvation in a generation across the world. If all of us took this responsibility to reach one. What I love about Jesus here is he not only sought out the one, but he noticed this man. He noticed this man. And in the multitude of people that we bump up against every day in our lives, we need to notice the one. And I've been asking God to help me to do this, because I must be like you, that days go by and I ignore people and I walk past people and I don't thank people as I should thank them. I don't say hello as I should. And after I think, why didn't I make more of that? Why didn't I treat them better in that circumstance? But what Jesus shows us here is he noticed the one. And I've been challenged to start noticing the ones that are around me. The bus driver, the person at the bank, the person behind the checkout. What about, I've been trying to read people's name badges and call them by name. You know how much it catches people off guard when you say their name when they're serving you. And in our culture that is so entitled, it is so easy for us to ignore people. They're paid to do this job. They're going to serve me. And we don't treat them with respect and with the love that Jesus treated people with. And so I've been challenging myself to notice people wherever I am, whatever situation. And you know that I'm married to an Ephesians 4 evangelist gifted woman who can get Jesus into any kind of conversation that is going on. And so I feel hopeless at this, and often I sit back and let her do the hard work, the heavy lifting. A good husband, but she does it. But actually I've been challenging myself that I need to be pursuing some people, that I need to be trying to open some doors. And it comes across very weird, and I'm very uncomfortable with it. I was in the bank this week, and the guy said, I actually need to talk to you in the office. So I went through to the office bit. They were looking at something, and I started to talk to him and try and find out about his life, and he started to kind of give me those side eyes, like, why are you asking me this? But I've been trying to be challenged with this idea of noticing the one, of trying to relate to the people that God brings around my world. And we have to intentionally take this vantage point, that we realize and we notice and we see people. It says there that when Jesus had seen this man, he'd noticed in there, it describes how he learnt of his condition, or he learnt of how he'd been in this condition for a long time. See, Jesus not only noticed him, but he began to understand some of this man's story. And I think this is crucial in how we reach out and how we treat people in our lives, is we've got to understand their story. I don't know about you, but I can very easily jump to conclusions and judge people according to their lifestyle, according to the decisions they've made. And when you then hear their story, you think, I don't know whether I would have turned out any better than you had. With the experiences that you've had in your in I don't know whether I'd be in any better a place. And I want to challenge you today to hear people's stories, to understand why it is that they are the way they are. Even those who seem to have it all together, to ask them, what's your story? What's your background? To understand their stories, it will rise a compassion in us that almost leads us and forces us to move on behalf of the person. See, Jesus saw this man, he noticed him, he understood his story, and therefore he worked the miraculous in his life. And I wonder if we could understand more people's pain, if we could understand more people's journeys and more people's lives, whether we would be more motivated to reach out to them and to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to help them out of their hopelessness. And so, but we've got to do this very, very intentionally. We have to take a vantage point of seeing the one, a vantage point of noticing the ones in our lives, and a vantage point that says, just for a minute, I'll take my eyes off myself and understand somebody else's story. And so Jesus hears that this man has been here for 38 years. He's moved with compassion, and he says to the man, do you want to get better? And maybe you've heard this story preached before, and people often focus on this scenario that plays out. He says, do you want to get better? A very strange question to a man that's been sat there for 38 years trying to get better. But Jesus asks him, and the man replies with some excuse and some difficulty, challenges that he's facing. And Jesus just says the words, pick up your mat. And immediately this man's healed. Isn't that incredible? He doesn't even touch him. He doesn't lay hands on him. He just says the word. I love that, because I think there's stuff in my life that I just need to cling to the words of Jesus for my situation, and it will be so. It's at his word that this man was healed. Incredible miracle that took place. Imagine the multitudes that are gathering there, knowing this man, knowing his name, knowing his story, and they've seen him get healed. Incredible moment. But what happens is the religious leaders come along. The religious leaders come along. And because of their vantage point that they'd taken on life, of obeying rules, of complying with cultural status quos, of treating people how they think people should be treated, they completely missed the miracle. See, there's a document called the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is the interpretation of the Old Testament law. So when you read an Old Testament law, there were Jewish scholars who embellished that law and unpacked it and put some rules. So if that's the law, this is what it means. And in the Mishnah, it described how nobody could carry anything on the Sabbath, on the day of the rest. Nobody could carry anything in a public place. So because this man had picked up his mat and was walking along with his mat, the Jewish leaders came along and told him that he was disobeying the law. In fact, it was a harsh punishment. He was to be stoned to death because he carried something in public on the Sabbath. And I can imagine these men coming along, they're kind of the clipboard brigade. Yeah, they come along with their clipboards. Listen, in the Mishnah it says you shouldn't be carrying your mat. You know those people that you can only have fun within the rules? Yeah, you get out the board game and they get out the rules at the same time because we've got to work within the rules. Some of you are sat here today. And this is what these Jewish leaders were like. But they missed the miracle that had taken place. A man's life had completely been transformed. Somebody who for 38 years had sat in the same place with the same condition had had his life miraculously turned around. But because of their vantage point, they missed it because they were so obsessed with their viewpoint and their vantage point on how they interpreted life. And here's what the religious leaders did. They majored on minors. It's called religion, religiosity. And we laugh at the clipboard brigade, and we laugh at these Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the law, and we read them through the New Testament, but then I begin to look at my own life and think, how many times am I just like them? Where I allow my status quo, my view of what it means to be a Christian, my view of how you should behave in church, of how you should live your life, and I allow that to overtake and become the vantage point by which I view other people. And we have to challenge ourselves not to take the place of religion, not to view life from the vantage point of religiosity. You know, when I went to Bible college, just in the first couple of weeks, somebody was speaking and said, as a student, take every single opportunity that is presented to you. And so I took that on board, and as well as doing a degree, I said yes to pretty much everything. When they needed a team for something, when there was an opportunity to go to a particular church, I just said yes and went for it. And one of the opportunities was to help run a youth club that took place in the village. The Bible college I went to is located in a village called Battersea, and there's probably around 500 people or so that live in that village, a tiny village. And in the parish church, in the hall behind, there was a youth club that was run by students of the college. And so we became part of that team. Leanne and I ended up leading that little youth work that was happening. And what would happen, just several kids from the village would come, and we would have a nice time, play some games, chat. Well, along from Battersea, just about a mile, there's a country lane, and then there's another village called Battersea Thorpe. And they do this commonly in England, that they choose a kind of quiet, quaint village, and then about a mile down the road, they attach a council estate to the village in the hope that it lifts people's kind of value of living and disperses them out of urban centers. So these people are living here, and as we started to do this youth work, we started to reach out into Battersea Thorpe. So they would cycle their bikes a mile down the country road, and they would come along to the youth club. You know that things began to get a bit messy in the youth club. Yeah, there was some swearing, some kids not behaving quite how the other kids had behaved from Battersea Village, and it was a challenge, but these kids were desperate for some hope. You know, at 10 o'clock at night, an ice cream van would go around Battersea Thorpe, and they weren't selling ice cream, you know. To the community there was a heavy drug culture in that small village, and these kids were living in the reality of that. And so we started to reach out with them until some members of the Battersea village began to get upset that the kids from Battersea Thorpe were coming into Battersea. And so some of these people that were in the village were part of the parish council. The vicar called Leanne and I one day to his house and said what a difficult situation he was in, that we can't have these kids in the village, we can't have these kids using the property, that they needed to behave better. And so it ended up that we had a meeting with the parish council. We went in the hall and they'd set up chairs. We were in one line this way and they sat opposite us, facing us, and they just hurled accusations, hurled stories of what these kids had done to them, and all we could do was reply that the kids just needed Jesus. That sorry that they were messing things up, sorry that they were making life uncomfortable, but what else are we here as Christians if not to reach the community that God has put on our doorstep? And it was very, very challenging, and it meant there were lots of changes that we had to make in the youth club. But I thought from that day on, we lived by the conviction that nobody is out with the grace of God. That nobody should be unwelcome here because of the way they smell or behave or live their lives, that everybody is welcome to hear the good news of the gospel. You know, Bethesda means house of grace or house of mercy, and it's so tragic that these people were gathered there sick and infirm for year after year in a place that was called the house of grace. But it was a place that provided shelter for them. And I think it gives a beautiful illustration for the church, because there might be people on the fringes of our church that are still struggling with certain things, still under challenges, but hey, they're under the shelter of the house of grace and mercy. And one day Jesus is going to encounter them, or they're going to encounter Jesus, and their life will be transformed. But we're never going to put them out of the gate. We're never going to put them out of the pool. They're never going to say you can't stay in these colonnades anymore. You know how it was back in the day. You had to behave to belong to a church. You had to have the right behavior. But you know today, in our world today, we can't expect people to behave how we want them to behave. They've got to be able to belong before they get to the place of believing, and then they can begin addressing some of their behaviors in their life. We've got to provide a house of grace for people, that we don't major on their minors. But you know, we can say it from here, we can put it in writing, we can even put it on a wall, but it's for each and every one of us to get the vantage point that all of us live like this, so all of us treat every single person with love and respect, and with a welcome that is equal for every single person that comes through these doors and wants to make this place home. And so let's live by the vantage point, not of religiosity, but the vantage point that Jesus had, that saw the one, noticed the one, and reached out to the one. And here, the antidote to religiosity is shown in the third vantage point that we see in this story. See, after Jesus had healed this man, it says that he slipped away. Because he didn't want to get caught up in the arguing about how this man's carrying his mat. I wonder if Jesus knew that by saying carry your mat, he would create a bit of trouble. But Jesus slipped away, and later he finds the man in the temple. And the man's completely been transformed. Imagine this man. He's going up to everybody that he ever knew. Look at me, I'm healed. I don't have to sit at the pool anymore. He's going around telling everybody the miracle that's gone on in his life. And Jesus comes up to him. And in the NIV it says, see, you are well. See, you are well. But if you understand the Greek behind this, the Passion Translation does it so well. It says, look at you now. You're healed. Look at you now. And what Jesus was saying to the man is, have a different perspective on yourself. Take a different vantage point. Look what's happened in your life. Look what has happened for you. And in here, there's a couple of things that are important to understand, because Jesus had healed him physically, but there was the greater work of salvation that needed to be shared with the man. The man needed not just the gift of healing, but the gift of salvation. And so Jesus goes to him and says, stop sinning, or something worse might happen to you. And sometimes people are caught up. Does that mean that there was a certain sin that had caused this sickness? But actually, when we understand what Jesus was saying there, what he was saying is, live like you're saved. Adjust your life, live for me, receive salvation. And we've got to just say this, as we reach out to people, as we reach out to the one, as we care for people, as we feed people, as we clothe people, as we provide centers for people to come and be safe and secure and do whatever we do to reach out to people, we've got to remind ourselves that it's the salvation of souls that we're going after. And I don't want to be part of feeding a city and putting a city in nice clothes and providing nice buildings, but they go to hell well-dressed and well-fed and had a nice life, but they didn't receive their eternal destinies transformed. So we've got to remember that. We don't use it, if you're not going to become a Christian, we won't help you. Never. We won't do that. We help people regardless. But the goal and the aim is to share the hope of the gospel with them. And we've got to understand that. That's our vantage point. It's eternal destinies that we're trying to transform as we reach out to others. But as Jesus comes to him, he leads him to salvation. But what he's also doing is saying, look at yourself, remind yourself what I did just moments ago. And I think that in our lives, we need to remind ourselves what God has done for us. The longer we go along this journey, the longer you're a Christian, the more danger you're in is in treating things and taking things for granted. And we have to remind ourselves that as we reach out to the one, we were once a one. Somebody once reached out to us. And you know, I didn't grow up in a Christian family. I didn't have grandparents that were Christians, great-grandparents that were Christians. I grew up not knowing anything, and I'm purely here because in 1992, we moved into a house next door to born-again Christians. And Joe and Jenny Kavanagh reached out to our family, shared the gospel, showed up when we went through difficult times, looked after us as kids, took us to church as kids, and I am here purely because I was the one for Joe and Jenny Kavanagh. And you wouldn't have a preacher if they hadn't reached out. And you know, they'll never have a microphone like this. They'll probably never stand and speak in front of a room like this big. And yet they just lived ordinary Christian lives and realized that God had put in their responsibility to reach this family that had moved next door to them. And so we've got to remind ourselves, I am eternally grateful that I was the one for somebody, that somebody reached out for me. And as we think about our salvation, we need to remind ourselves what a privilege we have to be saved. Because if we're not careful, we start to sing some of those songs and we say, my chains are gone, I've been set free, and then we start to mumble them, and then we put our hands in our pockets, and we lose the reality of what it means to be saved. See, some of you today, it's still fresh for you, and you are lifting up your hands and shouting your praise because you've not long been saved, and you know the feeling of being set free. It's so wonderful, but the longer we go on, we become more familiar, more entitled, more over familiar with everything that we've been given. And you know it because as soon as we say, here, we're going to pray together, we're going to have a prayer meeting, or we got a week of prayer, or hey, coming up might be another service that we had on a Sunday, and if we start to think, oh, another time to be in church, then we've missed it. Because do you remember when you were first saved and you couldn't wait to get to church? You remember when you were first saved and you couldn't wait to read this book in the morning, and you were asking questions about what this meant and that meant, that you had worship music on all the time, and you viewed everybody like everybody needs to get saved because they need this feeling, what it means to be saved. And you know, as we reach the one, we need to remind ourselves what it means to be saved. Remind ourselves what it was like when we were lost, when we didn't have the hope of eternal life, when we didn't have the gift of eternity that has been given to us. We got to remind ourselves, because if we're not careful, we'll take a vantage point that is familiar, that is entitled, and we'll begin overlooking people and getting more caught up with our religion than we are with the people that need reaching with the hope of the gospel. And so let's never take the vantage point of familiarity. I heard a preacher say last week, he was talking about, he's a big preacher, you probably know his name, but he was talking about how he goes to Hillsong Conference every single year, even when he's not preaching very regularly there at all, but he still goes along. And he said this, it's because it's like at Hillsong Conference, everybody got saved yesterday. There's so much passion, there's so much excitement. They worship God like they just got saved yesterday, and it does something for his soul. And it challenged me, and I thought, I wonder how I could live a life like I just got saved yesterday. That I stopped becoming so familiar with some of these things, that Jesus comes to me and says, look at yourself. Look what I've done in your life. Look at the work of a miracle that I've done in your life. We've got to take this vantage point to be able to reach the one. Because when we're fresh with our salvation, when we're fresh with our first love, when we're in love with Jesus, then it's a lot easier to be motivated to reach the ones in our life, to reach out to those who are around us. So I wonder where your vantage point is today. Maybe you've stopped thinking or noticing or seeing the one in your life. Maybe you stopped having compassion on people. You don't want to hear their stories anymore. You just look at their lives and judge them. Maybe you're taking that religious attitude where you started to see behavior as more important than what's going on in their hearts. Maybe you're doing a journey with somebody and you're so frustrated because of what they're doing with their life, and you've allowed that to become more important than the compassion and the love for them. Or maybe it is that you feel like you've forgotten what it was to be saved. That you've drifted and just become so familiar with all of this. So often other preachers will say it better than you can say it yourself. But I love the story of William Booth, and I'm going to read something that William Booth said or wrote, I don't know, but he's the founder of the Salvation Army. So inspiring, those early days of the Salvation Army, literally transformed the nation through their work. And he said this, not called, did you say? You've not heard the call. I think you should say that you've not heard the call. He said this, put your ear down to the Bible and listen and hear him bid you go and pull sinners out of the fire of sin. Put your ear down to the burden, the agonized of humanity, and listen to its pitiful wail for help. Go stand by the gates of hell. Hear the damned entreat you to go for their Father's house and bid their brothers and sisters and servants and masters not to end up here. And then he says, go and look in Christ's face, whose mercy you profess to obey, and tell him whether you'll join Christ, heart and soul, body and circumstance, in a march to publish his mercy to the world. I wonder what we need to do today to shake ourselves, to realize that there's people in our lives that God has put there only for you to reach. He's entrusted lives. The eternal destiny of people has been entrusted to you by those that you sit next to at work, by those in your family, by those in your school, at your school gate, wherever it is. God is entrusting us with the responsibility to reach out to people around us. What are we going to do with it? We're going to sit back and say, no, that's for the revival to do that job. That's for the preacher to do that job. Or are we going to take the responsibility for the one?